happened very quickly, all cascading from a few conversations, and a few of us were sort of looking quite closely at the Founders Memorial, and some of us, I suppose, have always been interested in questions of memory and questions of history in the context of Singapore. And so, when this project was announced, a few of us were looking at it quite intensely. So, I suppose I just want to open with some questions and examples of what I think, what in the general discussion elsewhere, mainly in Germany and in the United States, what they call the counter monument. And I'm just going to give an introduction to this genre of monuments called the counter monument. And then I'm going to transition into why I think that debate about counter monuments is actually quite useful for us to think through when we go through the Founders Memorial project. Okay. I sound as if I'm lecturing. I'm not lecturing. Okay. Cool. So.
You just press escape.
Escape. All right.
Sorry.
Yes.
Oh yeah. You just can't go to the corners. You can't go to the corners.
The mouse don't go.
Yeah. Or maybe you just use the keyboard. Yeah, it'll be fine.
Oh, okay, excellent. Okay, so just a few examples of what was happening in West Germany in the 1980s when there was this rash of projects, basically all surrounding the question of how Germany should remember its own sins, right? Basically, its own kind of war crime, in this case, of course, Nazism. So the question that was posed during that period of time was, how does a state incorporate its crimes against others into its own national memorial landscape? Under what memorial ages, whose rules does a nation remember its own barbarity? So this is obviously a complete reversal of the typical understanding, the typical notion of a monument, which tends to celebrate the achievements of a nation state, tends to place the nation state as the culmination of a historical struggle, a historical process, right? So this was I suppose, the paradox, the key question that a lot of the artists and architects had to ask themselves when they were designing memorials against fascism, memorials against war, violence, and of course the counterpart, memorials for peace and human rights. So the project that's often sort of cited as the beginning of how these types of questions are translated into design and architecture is this particular project in Hamburg, the famous Hamburg Disappearing Monument. Basically what it did was that the designer created a monument, I cannot believe how it's about this height, and over time the monument will slowly sink into the ground, and I suppose at the final point, I believe it was in 1993, the entire monument disappears, right? So every time, so when it was first built, people will be invited, there will be a stylus hung next to the monument such that you could inscribe your own memories onto the memorial. In other words, the audience or the spectator is invited to vandalize the memorial, right? And every time a certain section, which is called the human side section, is filled with vandalisms and memories and inscriptions, the monument will then be lowered, which then of course refreshes the surface for a new round of inscriptions, and slowly over time it completely disappears. Is there a way for me to get out of the, okay, let me just read this. This is, I suppose, one analysis by an art critic of what the effect and the intent of such a monument. Its aim is not to console, but to provoke, not to remain fixed, but to change, not to be everlasting, but to disappear, not to be ignored by its passerby, but to demand interaction, not to remain pristine, but to invite its own violation and desecration, not to accept graciously the burden of memory, but to throw it back at the town's feet. By defining itself in opposition to the traditional monument, traditional memorials past, the counter monuments illustrates concisely the possibilities and limitations of all monuments elsewhere, everywhere. So this is in a sense, right. One particular monument is often cited as capturing a lot of the characteristics, the agenda of the counter monument, and how it attempts to deal with this very paradoxical question, right? How the nation can remember its own crimes. In another rather similar project, a house that was destroyed during war and its Jewish inhabitants either murdered or sent elsewhere, the artist basically left the void as it is and started placing these placards with the names of the original inhabitants where they actually lived, right? So it remains a void, and the artist mounted these names of the forgotten or the lost inhabitants. And this is, I suppose, in other words, so the question is similar, is about how to remember a forgotten or murdered people. And this artist puts it, I think, very poignantly. Perhaps such a monument is no monument at all, but a memory of an absent monument. So I'm going to consolidate a lot of these key attributes of a counter monuments later in a table for us to sort of refresh our memory. And of course, we are all very familiar with Daniel Leviskin, who is also one of the jurors of the competition, and I'm sure he's very, very in tune with this entire discourse of the counter monument. And then I will also explain, I believe, why, from reading the Founders Memorial brief, why I think I find it very strange that he's one of the jury members. But anyway, so Daniel Leviskin, because of his projects dealing with the Holocaust memorials, is often being called the architect of trauma. Right? So this architect was able to deal with questions of painful past. And the classic, of course, project that we are all very aware of is the Holocaust Museum in Berlin. And for him, very similar to the strategy of the void, he also uses the void to provoke us to ask questions about a past, a tragedy that is the magnitude of which is beyond our ability to understand. No architecture, no words, no stories, no pictures, no photographs can capture the horror of the Holocaust. And the only responsible way to represent the Holocaust is to not represent it at all. You have to create a void. So because the magnitude of horror is beyond any kind of media, so the void in this case becomes an architectural device to communicate the impossibility of our imagination. We simply will not be able to understand what really went on in the Holocaust. Right? Its horror is simply impossible for us to understand. And so if you look, there's also, of course, another dimension to the void, which is that it allows, precisely because it is a void and it does not imprint a single message, it allows the viewers, the victims who have survived, the Jewish survivors to come in and, I suppose, reflect on their own individual memories. So that was what, I suppose, the entire Jewish experience and the Holocaust gave rise to an entire, this wave of counter-memorials and this thinking about how to build a memorial or a monument that is in many ways the opposite of the traditional memorial and monument. And we have here in the States a very similar case. Of course, they were dealing with rather similar, not entirely the same, but similar issues of how to deal with the horrors and the pain of the painful memories of the past. And we have here the Vietnam War, the AIDS epidemic, and of course 9/11. So again, a very classic example of the Vietnam War Veterans Memorial by Maya Lin. I'm sure you all know about this project. Maya Lin, when she won the competition, was merely an undergrad at Yale University, and she didn't haven't even graduated yet. What she submitted to the competition won the prize, but she also submitted the same project to her studio in class and she got a B. So never trust your grades. Yeah. So
Is it an actual submission?
yes, maybe it's more like. So so this is the actual submission. This is the actual submission. It is very the competition, like I said, is because it's just for a single memorial. It does not have all the other kinds of things that we have for the Founders Memorial, which is really quite a big project. But because it's just a memorial, it was very open. Lots of people participated. And basically this project I wanted just 2 drawings, and it was very schematic, very schematic, right? Just 2 perspectives. One showing its relationship with the ground, and the other showing its relationship with the traditional monument, basically the pillar, right? And so again, this of course provoked a lot of controversy precisely for the same reason that it basically refuses to adopt many of the same devices and moves of the traditional monument. A lot of people accused it, said it looks like urinal, it is shameful, you are dishonoring the veterans, all the sort of stuff. You can sort of understand why if you are used to this kind of monument. So when the veterans asked Maya Lin, what do you think people are going to do when they first come here, Maya Lin responded, they are going to cry. It's a very different kind of reaction that she would really want, a very different kind of emotional response that she wanted to elicit through the monument. Not the emotion of triumph, of celebration, of honoring and so on, but an emotion of something much more ambivalent. Right? War is war. It might be righteous war. It might be the war that was wrong, but it might be the necessary war. But war always has its costs. War always has its sacrifice. And though what is important, firstly, is that the names of the dead are arranged not alphabetically, but chronologically. Basically, the timeline in which they died. Right? Not chronologically, not alphabetically, but chronologically. It shows who died when, right? So by tracing the inscriptions of the names, all the names, I'm not sure if all the names are there, but there are about 58,000 or something like that. Names, it tells a very simple story of this linear time of death, right? Again, let me just try to remember what I wrote. Oopsie.
If you press escape.
Escape,
Yeah.
right? Okay. So again, because of its simplicity and its minimalist design, it allowed basically, again, you see there is no single message that is being projected out to the audience. There is no plaque that says anything about what this monument means. There is no attempt to say that, there's no official message attached to this monument. You are there to look at the names arranged chronologically in the sequence of death. Right? And what also happened is that because of the reflective surface, a lot of the critics and historians argued that the reflective surface again encouraged a kind of reflection that the spectator or the person who's here not only sees the name but also sees himself, and that encourages a kind of retrospective, inward looking of individual memories. And finally, what the monument did, of course, it has a certain relationship with this, with the traditional monuments. But what it also did was that it started to encourage people to leave things at the monument, right? Because now it is possible to pinpoint that person who is your relative and literally leave something here for him. Right? Because these are all individualized names. In the traditional monuments, there is no name, but in this monument, there's a name, and people started to leave little things where that particular person is located. And this created, again, another type of counter memorial, which is very kind of spontaneous counter memorial of people just leaving things along this wall. And if I'm not wrong, the memorial organizers or the caretakers of this memorial will always collect these little things and then put them elsewhere, and that becomes again another kind of exhibit. The exhibits of these spontaneous little memorials, right? So you see how this provoked a certain ritual, a certain interaction between the audience and the object, and that interaction or that ritual is often missing in the traditional monument. So the other main thing is, of course, the AIDS Memorial Quilt, the so-called largest community art project in the world, and also often called the Living Memorial because it keeps expanding. So it began as a kind of a community art project led by gay activists in San Francisco, basically to commemorate those people who died as a result of the AIDS pandemic. Of course, San Francisco was the worst hit. And as the memorial basically takes the shape of these 3 by 6 feet quilts that is sort of embroidered and made by people, turning something that is very craft and very traditional into a massive participatory project where anybody could commission or actually make themselves a quilt and contribute to this ever-expanding tapestry of names. Each particular quilt is again an individual story, right? So you start to see that the very important shift from the collective single narrative to the individualized kind of accumulated narratives of every individual victim or every individual person. So the quilt was first displayed. It grew and grew. Eventually, the entire quilt was displayed at the same place where I suppose you have the Maya Lin's Memorial. And by the time in 1988, it has grown to about 8,000 over quilts, and it has chapters in different cities of the United States. So again, it established a certain kind of ritual. So if the previous monument established a ritual of sort of leaving little acts of memorialization, little things, this one initiated a ritual of reading of names. So every time it's exhibited in full, there'll be a ritual of reading the names of those people who were added to the quilt. And if you visit this website, you realize that again, it is a living project in the sense that it's still going on. People are still making these quilts, and it's now of course entirely digitized. You can actually search for that particular person, whose quilt is of a certain design. All the designs are of course different, right? And finally, I'm not going to talk much about this. I just want to say one thing. There's something very similar between this and Maya Lin's in the sense that all the victims are also named, and then they are also, so all the names are printed on this reflective black balustrade thing along the pits where the original towers were. But in this case, the names were not in order of death. They were in order, kind of what they call agencies, right? So at the time of the strike, who was next to whom, right, in the tower, right? So the names were sort of arranged to suggest the spatial relationships between of the victims at the point of the strike, right? So they were able to establish some sense of who was where in the tower, and then somehow establish that sequence and spatiality through the arrangements of the names. And that became, of course, extremely poignant and powerful because this is not a kind of a long-drawn death, but this is a kind of an instant death. And you have an instant death, especially with all the very telegenic, all the videos of people jumping off buildings and just the towers toppling down. What was most important for all the people who was sort of looking at this spectacle was to know where their relatives were at that point in time, right? Where they were when the towers were toppling down. And so what was important was not the chronology of death, but the spatial agency of death. So a table to help us, I suppose, just collect our thoughts to understand the difference between the counter monument and the monument. If the monument is didactic and is based on the ability to represent a past, didactic in the sense that I'm telling you what happened, I teach you what's happening. It's didactic. But the counter monument provoked critical reflection and performance. It asks you to look into yourself. The circumspection, it is open-ended. It often involves some kind of performance, not a kind of acting out, a kind of ritual that encourages people to actually touch the monument and use that monument. It elicits emotions. It transmits knowledge, which is, I suppose, quite similar to the first category. The counter monument destroys distance, and in so doing, destroys its own authority as the vessel of meaning. By distance, I mean the distance between the spectator and the object. Right? It destroys distance, so it gets people to touch it, to vandalize it, to somehow grapple with it. Whereas the traditional monument is always seen from a distance. There's something sacred about it. You don't really want to touch it. Even if you touch it, it's just that. Right? The architectural device or the rhetorical device often it highlights things like transience, absence, accumulation. The traditional monument often highlights permanence, timelessness, and the sacred. The counter monument emphasizes the democratization of memory and of the individual witnessing and naming of people. The monuments often emphasizes the concretization of a single history of great men and their quotes or their legacies. And we'll see quite a bit of that when we get down to the Founders Memorial. So this is the Founders Memorial. So I was going through the brief quite a few times. So this is, I suppose, just my take of the brief. I'm not saying that this is, I'm sure when you read the brief, you probably have different kinds of reactions to it. So the site is here, is cited here for a variety of reasons, one of which is of course to use the urban spectacle as the backdrop to the monument, and that nothing speaks more of success, of course, than Marina Bay, right? This Marina Bay is the global face of Singapore. It is also the national face of Singapore. So for me, when I read the brief, I think it was quite, there are some important things that I think we should pick out. One is that while spaces for contemplation, these are quotes from the brief, may be provided, there should not be any iconographic figures resembling or bearing the likeness of any of the founding fathers of the Founders Memorial. So no statues, no the kind of, this is Lee Kuan Yew and this is, a Goking Sui, etc. So no statuaries, no mimicking, no likeness of great men. It also makes it very clear that the memorial should be dignified, inspiring, etc., without being somber or archaic. I think this is a very clear hint. Well, it's not really a hint, it's very direct. By basically saying that we don't want you to create things about death and tragedies and sacrifices, this kind of messages. Nothing somber. Archaic links back to this. We do not want the traditional kind of monument, which is the traditional bust of a man, right? Something very the classic kind of monument. The objective of the monument is listed here. Again, it is in many ways the traditional, I believe, the traditional monument that is very much looking, trying to celebrate the founding of the nation and using the nation as the kind of narrative of progress and success from basically the entire post-independence period. So it valorizes patriotism, unity, the single narrative. So if you flip through the brief, there is a very thick appendix attached. Appendix 1 to 3 basically gives you the narrative. Right? You're not free to inject a certain narrative. You have to deal with the given narrative. Now, of course, it can mean that you can interpret the narrative according to some kind of creative license, but the narrative is given. And the narrative is given as a series of events and a series of quotes. Now this is very classic traditional monuments, right? So it's not about the individualization of names, but the quotation and the legacies of great men. But of course there is a twist to it because the great men cannot be shown in their individual likeness. And we'll get to that paradox at some point. So this is the, so some of the events have been listed, and I think if you go through the events, you will see that it is quite a classic Singapore story narrative. So we have selective quotes from founders' attempts, from the founders, and I think these quotes transforms them into figures that are both heroic and personable, right? They're not just these giant figures, but because you are directly quoting them, they also become individual humans, right? These founders are humans struggling against enormous odds, right? So, and there is, if you look at the entire narrative, there's a sense of historical inevitability. We are destined to succeed, you know, with such wonderful people at the helm. There is this momentum that is just pushing us towards our current greatness and success. But this sense of inevitability is dramatized by a sense of vulnerability and precariousness. Again, this is a very classic Singapore story. Now, our success comes at great, our success is very vulnerable. Right? We have to be precious about it. We don't rock the boat, right? So the sense of precariousness is often told through the story of the unexpected nation. That, you know, nobody expected us to succeed. Nobody expected us to be able to stand in as our own nation. We wanted to be merged with Malaysia. They kicked us out. We were thrown outside. We were alone, but we still made it. Right? So the sense of historical achievement is dramatized by the sense of precariousness. Unfortunately, from my perspective, I think there is a refusal to acknowledge all the challenges to Singapore's history that has been coming out over the last 10-20 years, and it also ignores the fact that the nation in today's world is quite different from the nation in 1960. And it ignores that by insisting on sort of pulling out timeless lessons from the past, the hard truths of Singapore. There is also, I believe, a whitewashing of the politics of struggle and the sacrifices of the common people that I think can be reinserted into the project, because I think this is not really foreclosed, or it's not really sort of if you look at the brief, it's still possible to reinsert that into the project. But I think for any of us who have worked on the history of Singapore, will realize that particularly this episode is really highly contested. There are so many people trying to reinterpret this moment based on fresh evidence. There's so many the current debate about, you know, this particular period. Of course, we all heard of the 6-hour interrogation of the historian by Minister Shanmugam, our Minister of Law, and that kind of struggle over history, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, is not acknowledged in the sequence of events that is in the appendix. As we all know, you know, how you open the story can change the story altogether, right? So instead of long ago, you say in one dark stormy night, the entire story changes, which is why 1950s is so sensitive, right? Because it's the opening of the Singapore story. So I'm not suggesting that the entire discussion or the entire kind of counter-monuments debate and architectural discussion and strategy can be directly implanted into the Founders Memorial. What I'm suggesting is that if we think carefully about these types of questions, about what is left out, what is put into the brief, I think there are really quite a few interesting paradoxes that can be the foundation of us thinking about the Founders Memorial in very, very interesting and provocative ways. So one question I'd like to pose, so what I'm doing here is to pose a series of questions, which is very similar to the first question that was posed to the handbook artist, right? How can the nation remember its own barbarity? right? So let us pose a few questions to ourselves. How to remember a past that gave birth to us, but yet is a past we no longer can recognize? I think all of us have liked looking at pictures of old Singapore because it dramatizes progress and look at how amazing, how much we have transformed. But every time we look at old photographs of Singapore, there is always a sense of lament. How much is lost? There is always a nostalgia for what was lost as a result of progress, right? There's never a single unadulterated sense of celebration. Right? Progress always carries with it a sense of lament. And there is a sense of lament because we can't recognize the Singapore that gave birth to us. The second question is how to remember a generation of great men without remembering them as great men. Now this paradox is of course touched on a little bit in the brief. So when the brief says that you cannot have the likeness of Lee Kuan Yew or Goh Keng Swee or any of the founders, you cannot create statues of them. It is very similar to this, right? So you have to remember the founders, but you cannot remember them as great men. You might remember them as values. You might remember them as a generation. You might remember them as a story, but you cannot remember them individually as heroes. This is, of course, I believe, a kind of balancing act between this desire to monumentalize and yet, and again, this is all we're very clear of, Lee Kuan Yew's personal aversion to any kind of monumentalization, and he has made this very clear again and again that he does not want to be monumentalized. He does not want people to build a statue of him. He does not want people to sort of memorialize him. So there is this kind of tension, and of course with the Oxley Road debate, you simply cannot avoid the fact that there is this enormous tension, right, between this controversy and contradiction about how we can remember the founding generation of Singapore. How to remember when the Singapore story requires amnesia by descent. So all of us who have studied, those who have studied history, memory, the modern condition will often say that all kinds of remembering requires forgetting. I believe that this is definitely the case it's the case everywhere, but in Singapore it also requires a certain degree of forgetting. We need to, in order to subscribe to this story, we need to forget all these other stories, right? But I think a better way of thinking about the Founders Memorial and this very important episode of our past is to ask ourselves, should we not try to develop a historical consciousness that requires that acknowledges what we do not know, that acknowledges what we cannot know, and not just celebrates what we want to know. And I think that is a much more sophisticated kind of historical consciousness that will really be useful to allow Singaporeans to come to terms with the politically contested nature of their own history, that there is a lot that we do not know. Right. So how is it that we do not know so much of our own history and yet we can speak so confidently of it? I can ask anybody in the audience a simple historical question, who did what when? And then I'm sure a lot of you will I don't know. So, but yet we can always speak so confidently of the past, about the past. We look at a picture and say, oh, Singapore's history is a history of progress. There's always this meta-narrative that organizes our thoughts, right? Conditions us to think in a certain way. As beneficiaries of history, and we are all beneficiaries of history right now in this room, how can we account for the cost of success? How do we account for the cost of success? What was sacrificed in our pursuit of progress? I think we need to move beyond a binary between a history that we want to celebrate and a history that we want to condemn or hide or mourn. There is this very unhealthy binary. This is the history that we want, and that history we try to ignore. I don't think that is a very healthy relationship. I think what we can think about is that relation. We should focus not on this or that, but we should focus on the relationship between the two. How is this relationship changing? And I think it is changing quite dramatically. And I think the Founders Memorial, when it comes out in whichever form, shape, or color, it will have a dramatic effect on this relationship between the two kinds of history of Singapore. Thank you.